Story 1. They say every house has a story, but I never imagined mine would turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of saving, I finally bought my first home, a charming two-story Victorian nestled at the edge of a quiet town. Its weathered facade and creaky floorboards gave it character, and I was eager to restore it to its former glory. Little did I know, it wasn't just history hiding in those walls. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. Not dread, exactly, but something heavy, like the air was thicker within the house. I chalked it up to nerves, a mix of excitement and anxiety about this massive milestone. The real estate agent had mentioned the house was over a century old and had gone through several owners, but she brushed off my questions about why it had been on the market for so long. People prefer newer builds these days, she had said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The first week passed uneventfully. I spent my days unpacking, and my nights curled up with a glass of wine, admiring the ornate woodwork and the grand staircase. It was exactly the kind of place I'd always dreamed of owning. But then, small things started happening. It began with the noises. At first, I dismissed them as the house settling. Groaning wood, the occasional creak of a loose floorboard. But soon, they became more deliberate. A faint tapping at the window when no one was outside, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when I was in bed. I told myself it was my imagination, a side effect of living alone in an old house. But deep down, I knew better. One night, I woke to the sound of a door slamming. Heart racing, I grabbed my phone and crept downstairs, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The front door was locked, and all the windows were closed. Still, I could feel a chill in the air, a cold that seemed to seep from the very walls. As I turned to go back upstairs, I noticed something odd. The basement door, which I was certain I had left shut, was ajar. I froze. The basement had been the one part of the house I hadn't explored yet. The thought of descending those narrow, rickety stairs into the darkness filled me with a primal unease. But curiosity won out. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and headed down, the beam slicing through the inky blackness. The basement was unfinished, its stone walls damp and crumbling. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just old tools, a rusted furnace, and a few cobweb-covered boxes. But as I moved the flashlight around, the beam landed on something that made my stomach lurch. A small door, barely 3 feet high, set into the far wall. It was painted black and secured with a heavy padlock. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that door. It didn't make sense. It wasn't on the floor plan, and the real estate agent had never mentioned it. The logical part of my brain told me to leave it alone, but something about it felt wrong. I turned and hurried back upstairs, deciding to deal with it in the morning. That night, I dreamed of the door. In my dream, it wasn't locked. It swung open effortlessly, revealing a narrow tunnel that stretched endlessly into the darkness. A figure stood at the end, its face obscured, but its presence filled me with a terror so intense I woke up gasping for air. The next day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. The door was all I could think about. By afternoon, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a crowbar, I descended into the basement. The air down there felt colder than before, and I could swear I heard faint whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. The padlock was old and rusted, and it took some effort, but eventually, it gave way with a loud snap. My hands trembled as I pulled the door open. Behind it was a narrow passageway, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone. The air smelled damp and metallic, like iron and earth. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the flashlight's beam barely illuminating the path ahead. The tunnel wasn't long, maybe 20 feet, but it felt like an eternity before I reached the end. There, I found another room. It was small and circular, with walls carved out of the earth. At its center was an old wooden table, and on it lay an array of strange objects. A cracked mirror, a bundle of dried herbs, and a journal bound in leather. The air in the room felt charged, like static before a thunderstorm. I picked up the journal and opened it, my hands shaking. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, detailing rituals and incantations I couldn't understand. but one word kept appearing over and over: Watcher. As I stood there, the flashlight flickered and the whispers grew louder. I spun around, the beam darting across the room, but I saw nothing. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I bolted back to the basement, slamming the small door shut and wedging the crowbar against it. I told myself I'd call someone: the police, a historian, anyone who could make sense of what I'd found. But deep down, I knew this was beyond anything they could handle. That night, the dream came again. This time, the figure stepped closer. I could see its eyes now, hollow and black, like twin voids staring into my soul. It whispered a single word: leave. When I woke, the house felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. Objects began to move on their own. A chair sliding across the floor, books tumbling off shelves, and always the sound of footsteps when no one was there. I've tried to leave. Twice, I packed a bag and made it as far as the front door. But each time, I was overcome with an inexplicable sense of dread, as if the house itself wouldn't let me go. The second time, I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and firm, though when I turned around, no one was there. Now, I'm sitting in the living room, writing this down in the hope that someone will find it. The noises have started again, louder this time, and I can feel the walls closing in. The basement door just creaked open on its own, and I know I'm out of time. If you're reading this, please, don't come looking for me, and whatever you do, stay away from the house. It doesn't want to be found, and neither do I. Story 2. When I first moved into the city, I thought I had lucked out. The apartment was small but cozy, tucked away in an unassuming building on the edge of downtown. It wasn't fancy, but the rent was affordable, and it came with a view of the skyline that made it feel like I was living in a postcard. My friends joked that I must have found the only decent place in the city that didn't require selling a kidney to afford. If only I'd known the cost wasn't measured in money. It started with the elevator. The building was old, and the elevator matched, an antique contraption with a scissor gate and a grinding motor that groaned whenever it moved. I didn't mind. It added character. At least, that's what I told myself. But within a week, I started noticing odd things. The elevator seemed to have a mind of its own. It would stop on random floors, the doors sliding open to reveal empty hallways. Sometimes it would refuse to move at all, as if daring me to take the stairs. Once, it dropped a full floor before jolting to a stop, leaving me clutching the scissor gate and gasping for air. When I mentioned it to the building manager, he just shrugged. "It's old," he said. "You'll get used to it." I wasn't sure I wanted to. One night, I came home late from work. The kind of late where the streets are deserted, and the city feels like a different world. The elevator was waiting for me on the ground floor, the scissor gate already open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for my floor, leaning against the wall as the motor whirred to life. But instead of going up, the elevator descended. I frowned and jabbed the button again, but it didn't respond. The numbers above the door ticked downward. B1, B2, B3. I hadn't even realized the building had a basement, let alone 3 levels of it. By the time the elevator shuddered to a stop, I was gripping the rail so tightly my knuckles were white. The doors slid open, revealing a dark, concrete corridor lined with flickering fluorescent lights. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay inside, but the elevator refused to move, its motor silent and unyielding. I stepped out, my shoes echoing against the cold floor. The air down there felt different, heavier somehow, like it was pressing against my skin. The corridor stretched on in both directions, vanishing into shadows. The walls were bare, except for the occasional streak of rust or grime. As I turned to call for help, I realized something that made my stomach lurch. The elevator doors were gone. The shaft I'd stepped out of was nothing more than a blank concrete wall. Panic set in. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps loud and frantic. I called out, my voice trembling, but the only response was the hum of the lights. The further I went, the stranger it became. Doors began to appear along the walls, each one slightly different. Some were wooden and ornate, others metal and industrial. None of them had handles. I tried pushing one open, but it didn't budge. The next door I tried was locked, and the one after that. Frustration mounting, I banged on the nearest door, shouting for help. That's when I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. The corridor was empty, but the sound continued, growing louder. It wasn't footsteps, exactly, but something heavier, like the dragging of a large object. I backed away, my eyes darting between the shadows. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, something moved. It was hard to make out. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its limbs were elongated and bent at unnatural angles, like a marionette with its strings tangled. It didn't walk so much as it lurched, its body swaying as it dragged itself forward. I froze, my mind racing. It didn't seem to have a face, just a smooth, featureless expanse where one should have been. But somehow, I knew it was watching me. The air grew colder as it moved closer, its every step echoing like a drumbeat in my chest. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging through me. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors blurring past as I sprinted. The thing behind me didn't speed up, but its steady, relentless pace made it feel like it was gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. Just as my lungs began to burn, I spotted something up ahead, a door slightly ajar, light spilling out into the corridor. I veered toward it, slamming my shoulder against the wood and stumbling inside. The door shut behind me with a heavy thud, and I collapsed against it, gasping for air. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single chair and a desk piled high with old papers. A bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. I scanned the room for another exit, but there was none. My only option was the door I'd just come through. And then I heard it. The shuffling sound was back, louder now, accompanied by the faint scrape of claws against concrete. It stopped just outside the door, and the handle rattled. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open an inch. A hand, if you could call it that, slid through the gap, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with jagged nails. I scrambled backward, my eyes darting around the room, for something, anything, I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a heavy paperweight on the desk, and I hurled it at the door with all my strength. The door slammed shut, and the thing outside let out a sound that chilled me to my core. A low, guttural growl that didn't sound remotely human. The light above me flickered, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wouldn't hold for long. Desperation took over. I started digging through the papers on the desk, hoping for some kind of clue. That's when I found it, a map, crudely drawn, showing the corridors and rooms of the basement. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Don't trust time." Before I could make sense of it, the door burst open, and the creature lunged inside. Its movements were chaotic, limbs flailing as it scrambled toward me. I darted around the desk, clutching the map like a lifeline, and bolted through the open door. This time, the corridors were different. They twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, the walls shifting as if the building itself were alive. Doors appeared and disappeared at random, some opening into more corridors, others into dead ends. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing against a wall as the map slipped from my hands. The last thing I remember is the sound of the creature's footsteps, impossibly close, and the whisper of its voice, low and guttural. "You'll never leave." When I woke, I was back in the elevator, the scissor gate rattling as it ascended. My floor dinged and the doors slid open. Everything looked normal, but I knew better. The corridors still feel longer than they should, and sometimes, when the elevator descends, I hear the faint scrape of claws on concrete. Story 3. I wasn't supposed to be out there after dark. The forest stretched for miles behind my grandparents' old cabin, a maze of towering pines and dense underbrush that swallowed the sunlight by mid-afternoon. They'd always warned me, Stay close to the trails, and if the sun starts to set, come straight home. I listened for the most part. But that evening, curiosity got the better of me. The trail I was following forked in a direction I didn't recognize. A narrow path overgrown with moss and weeds. It felt like it had been forgotten, hidden by time. I knew I should have turned back, but something about it called to me. The way the trees arched overhead, forming a tunnel of green, felt almost welcoming. By the time I realized how far I'd wandered, the sky was a deep shade of violet, and the first stars were beginning to prick through the canopy. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn led me deeper into the woods. The trees seemed closer now, their trunks impossibly wide, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. And then I saw it, a cabin, nestled in a small clearing, its roof sagging and its windows dark. I'd never heard of another cabin in these woods. My grandparents' place was the only one for miles, but there it was, as real as the chill crawling up my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the rustling leaves. No answer, just the steady chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the hope that someone inside could help me find my way home. The door was ajar, creaking softly as it swayed in the breeze. I stepped closer, peering inside. The cabin was sparse, its furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. A single oil lamp sat on the table, its glass smudged with fingerprints. Against my better judgment, I crossed the threshold. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. The walls were lined with shelves, each crammed with jars of varying sizes. Some were filled with what looked like herbs or dried flowers, while others contained murky liquids that obscured their contents. One jar, larger than the rest, sat at eye level, its glass cracked. I leaned in, squinting to make out what was inside. That's when I heard it, a soft, wet plop. Something heavy landed on the floor behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The cabin was empty, the door still ajar. But the sound hadn't come from outside. It had come from above. Slowly, I tilted my head back, my eyes tracing the beams of the ceiling. At first, I saw nothing, but then, in the far corner, a shape began to emerge from the shadows. It was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched and sinewy. Two glowing eyes fixed on me, unblinking and filled with an intelligence that felt utterly alien. I stumbled back, knocking over the lamp. The crash shattered the silence, and the thing moved. It didn't crawl or leap, it flowed, its body contorting in ways that defied logic. Before I could scream, it was inches from my face, its breath hot and rancid. "You shouldn't be here," it rasped, its voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It leaned closer, its eyes boring into mine. "They'll smell you." I don't remember running. One moment, I was frozen in place, and the next, I was crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The forest seemed alive, its shadows stretching and shifting, reaching for me. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of my grandparents' porch light in the distance. When I burst through the door, gasping and trembling, my grandmother's face went pale. She didn't ask where I'd been or what had happened. She just grabbed my arm and pulled me into the kitchen, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Did you see it?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Did it touch you?" I shook my head, unable to form words. She nodded, grimly, and began rummaging through a cabinet, pulling out jars of her own, ones filled with pungent herbs and thick, amber liquids. She worked quickly, muttering under her breath, as she mixed them into a paste and smeared it across my forehead and wrists. The smell was overwhelming, but I didn't dare protest. "What's going on?" I finally managed to whisper. "You strayed too far," she said, her eyes darting to the window. "There are things in these woods, things that don't take kindly to trespassers. You're lucky you made it back." Her words sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I glanced at my grandfather, who sat silently in his chair, his hands gripping the armrest tightly. His eyes were fixed on the window, his jaw clenched. That night, I didn't sleep. My grandmother stayed up too, sitting by the door with a shotgun across her lap. The forest outside was quiet, unnervingly so, as if it were holding its breath. The next morning, she made me promise never to stray from the trails again. I didn't need convincing. Whatever I'd seen in that cabin, whatever had spoken to me, wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about its words. They'll smell you. I can't help but wonder, was it warning me? Or was it making a promise?